Gibraltar is blessed with a rich variety of natural and human history. The rock and the town below have been home to many cultures and people over the centuries. The artifacts, monuments and memories that remain become our heritage, a common inheritance which we all share. And as Gibraltar moves forward and grows, it is up to us as a society to make sure this heritage endures and becomes a part of our future as well. Leading this effort is the Gibraltar Heritage Trust, an independent statutory body entrusted with the preservation of our heritage, whose aim it is to ensure that modern Gibraltar retains history and heritage at its heart. Water is essential to life. Throughout history, great civilizations and cities have sprung up from around rivers, lakes and deltas, giving humans access to this vital resource and therefore the ability to thrive. Inversely, water shortages and droughts have been disastrous, causing famine and terrible loss of life. Being surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea and with no natural water sources on the rock, occupants of Gibraltar have had to be resourceful through the ages when it comes to sourcing and storing potable water. In the present day, AquaGib is responsible for producing, storing and delivering water to our homes. Essential to their operations are a series of large underground reservoirs excavated in the rock between the late 19th and mid-20th centuries.
So we're at Waterworks, which is basically where we have a set of reservoirs, 12 in total, which are the main storage and supply of potable water to Gibraltar. Maximum capacity we can hold is approximately or just under 73 million litres of water. Our biggest reservoir holds a maximum of about 9 million litres. And yeah, that is obviously a maximum capacity, but we normally target anywhere between 60 million and 68 million on a daily basis. So we have two desalination plants. They use a system known as reverse osmosis, which is basically a process of filtration. Water is produced at two locations, like I mentioned, and once it's remineralized, meaning that it's fit for consumption, the water is pumped up to Waterworks. And from here, what we do is that we either store the water for future dates, or normally within a couple of weeks we would be using that water. If not, it goes straight into supply, which means that basically water goes straight into our reservoirs and then is distributed to the population. Let's put it this way, if the reservoirs weren't here, it would be very difficult to continue supplying Gibraltar. And I mean this because as much as you want to produce, you require some sort of storage area for worst case scenarios. So these reservoirs, what they bring is, one is obviously quality control, so we can store water and keep it safe and healthy for people to drink. But it also gives you that, it gives you a redundancy where if worst case scenario you can't produce any water, at least you have some form of backup. If we talk about historical issues, basically what was happening was that they were running out of water to supply, or there was lack of water to supply to the population. So the idea was, as far as my understanding is, that it was to build reservoirs to capture as much rainwater as possible to supply further along the year. And we've kept that same thought process on, which is we produce, store and supply at the same time.
Well, as you know, Gibraltar as a town was established in a place where you have no river basins really, no immediate access to potable water, other than perhaps wells that were sunk. But these wells, if you abstract them too quickly, they become brackish. So very quickly in Gibraltar, the concept of having to store rainwater into some recipient or other became the means of getting potable water for the people. History goes back obviously a long time. We had Nun's Well, an interesting underground tank which collected water from the outside. Even in the Moorish castle that we see here, they had cisterns which collected water from the ramparts. In the 1500s, there was an aqueduct built, a number of reservoirs at Rocher Road, which is now Rocher Road, and which collected water from the Alameda Sands. And that water was conveyed all the way to where the City Hall is now, to the place, in fact, called Fountain Ramp. The reason why it's called Fountain Ramp is because there was a fountain there to supply water from these works. Because Gibraltar's population was small in those days, this was sufficient. It was sufficient up to around the 1790s, when the population of Gibraltar really escalated from something like 3,000 to 4,000 to about 16,000. And then the need for potable water was so great that the existing sources couldn't take it. In the 1860s, there was a commission looking at barracks in areas such as Corfu, Malta and Gibraltar, and that commission highlighted the need to have sanitary commissioners established in Gibraltar to look into many things, from drains to roads, etc., and obviously for water supply. So what we are dealing with today really are from the times of the sanitary commissioners onwards. The sanitary commissioners looked towards the isthmus, where they dug wells and were lucky to find a good amount of water. They thought that this solved the problem. They inherited two tanks, one in Europa Road and one at Moorish Castle here, from the military. These tanks were then used to receive water pumped from the North Front wells and to be distributed throughout Gibraltar, and the whole system of mains, etc., was established. However, very soon after that, the salinity of the water supply became so high that it could not be used for drinking water. So the idea then was use the saline water for many things where you don't need potable water, such as firefighting, street cleaning, flushing of toilets, etc., etc. The sanitary commissioners then developed a different system for the supply of potable water. And that started off, first of all, by these areas around here, the crevices being cemented over, the vegetation stripped off, and that supplied an area of catchment of fresh water that then flowed into the Moorish Castle tank below. That was fine, but around the 1898, there was a need to further expand that. The idea then was to construct 4 reservoirs. We actually see the entrances here. They contain what nowadays we would say 5,500 meter cubed of water. I mean, just to give people an idea, each reservoir would contain something like 2.5 million bottles, 2-liter bottles of Coca-Cola nowadays, you know, but obviously of water. Those were constructed, and an area of the northwest at the top of the rock was cleared of vegetation. Again, the cracks filled over with cement, the whole thing painted over with a lime and cement slurry. And this was about the equivalent of about 8 football pitches in terms of area. And that provided a substantial amount of collecting area for water that fell from rainfall to be conveyed to the reservoirs here. Like Victorians always like to do, when they do something, they sort of embellished. They had their own ideas of things, and because we were near the Moorish Castle, they decided that the valve house would be done in a sort of their concept of Arabic or Moorish architecture. This is the valve house to the 4 reservoirs, what we call reservoirs 1, 2, 3 and 4, and done between 1898 and 1900. The actual civil engineering of all this was done by someone called William Copeland. In fact, William Wallace Copeland, clearly Scottish. He was the civil engineer to the sanitary commissioners, and he really conceived the system as we know it today. The works were obviously of such magnitude that it attracted the visit of the King and the Queen at the time, who sort of came back from India after their coronation in Dunbar. The Victorians tried to do the valve house in what they conceived to be their conception of Arabic and Moorish styles. What we have here is a valve house. You have valves where each reservoir could be put into service, and what you see in these wooden boxes are really manometers. They contained mercury. What happened is that they gave you the level of the reservoir at any given time. Nowadays, of course, everything is digital, so none of this is in operation. It's just been preserved here due to its heritage value.
Since the British capture of Gibraltar, tunnelling the interior of the rock has always been exploited as a way of creating defensive positions and accommodating essential and potentially sensitive infrastructure. Stretching 800 metres from east to west and 103 metres above sea level, the Waterworks tunnel was driven to accommodate a series of what would eventually be 6 reservoirs, built between 1911 and 1945, capable of holding in excess of 33,000 cubic metres of water.
Mr. Copland, after having finished the works that I described previously, and because there was a greater need for water all the time, he conceived the idea of using the sand slopes on the east side of the rock as a catchment area. In order to do that, he obviously had to bring that water out to the 4 reservoirs we saw before, we mentioned before. So in 1903, the tunnel which we are covering now was actually constructed. It was started from the east and the west, and they met in the middle very accurately. What you see on the right here is the wall of the channel that's behind that. The guy had the presence of mind of looking at the amount of area that would be available to him for water in the long term. So he designed the channel to take 100 millimeters of rainfall on the areas that he speculated he was going to get, which is an awful lot of water. And the channel was constructed to take that. So having done that, they then constructed this reservoir a few years later, in 1915, which is one of the biggest reservoirs we have. It's almost 10,000 cubic meters. And they started it by tunneling from underneath, about 7.6 meters below here. There's another tunnel, which they used to get in, and then they widened and created this big chamber. The reservoir itself is actually hewn out of the rock, but it clearly, the floor is made out of special concrete, waterproofing, water resistant, etc. And the sides are made of concrete blocks with a gap in between, again filled with an impermeable slurry. And behind those blocks, between the blocks and the rock, is mass concrete. And again with an additive. At that time they used to call it padlo. It's an additive to make the thing water resistant. This started this area of reservoirs that we have now. We will now go to reservoir number 8. After they did reservoirs 5 and 6, which is, as I said before, was done by driving in a tunnel and then opening on either side. They thought that it was better to offset these reservoirs from the tunnel and to use the lower tunnel as a means of laying pipelines and as a means of an overflow in case there was too much water coming in and it had to overflow safely. So from 7 to 10 reservoirs are all offset from the main tunnel. Apart from number 5 and 6, this is the only one that is oriented parallel to the tunnel itself. Obviously at that time they must have had some spare balustrade available or whatever, but they embellished the reservoir by putting this sort of type of fence around it. There's only about a couple of meters of water here at the moment, but it's sufficiently clear that you can actually see the bottom of the steps. If the water was further up, what you would be able to see is a reflection of the roof. The interesting thing about these reservoirs is that the rock itself is very self-supporting. The rock itself is sufficiently strong to withstand its own weight, and we have something like 300 meters of rock above us. But of course, to contain the water and make sure that water doesn't seep out, then it had to be constructed, as I mentioned before, with blockwork, concrete, water excluding type of cement and that type of thing. What we have here is reservoir number 10. Around 1938, this reservoir and number 9 had already been excavated. Number 9 had been completed, but this one was just a big chamber. But in 1938, the team that the City Council had for building reservoirs and tunnels, that were mainly Gibraltarians and some Spaniards, were diverted to excavate air raid shelters. I mean, it's interesting that somebody knew what was coming in 1938, because war wasn't declared until 1939, and they started preparing for it. So by the time the war came, this chamber had been excavated, but the reservoir hadn't been constructed. And what they constructed was a 3-story barracks for the Black Watch. You can imagine having about 300 meters of rock on top of you. It made a really bomb-proof barracks for the soldiers. This communicated with the lower tunnel that I mentioned before, and in that lower tunnel, certainly the last time I was there, I could still see some of the latrines, the cookhouse, the ablutions areas that they had. But then, after 1945, clearly everything was back to normal, and they constructed this particular reservoir. At this point in the lower tunnel, you come across a fissure which was used as an overflow. We come here to an area of the rock where, in fact, the geology starts getting slightly different. In fact, from here on, there is a need to put a roof onto the tunnel. What happens is that here we are bridging a fissure, a natural fissure, which goes all the way down to sea. And they used that as a means of overflowing. So when all the reservoirs were full and they needed to release water, they would do it through here. But more importantly, what happened was that during the beginning of the rain season, the water that would come from the catchment would be very murky. So they opened this valve and all the water was just let down to waste. And the foreman would look at the water, and when it cleared, he would then close the valve and divert the other water to the reservoirs, because there wasn't enough space here to have filtration and all the other sophisticated water treatments that would have been necessary if you collected all the muck that came from the catchments. So essentially, when the water was clear, then it was guided to the reservoirs. The reservoirs, in fact, because they are inside the rock, there's no light to it, so any little bacteria that may have gone with the water would naturally die. Although the water was chlorinated, obviously, just to make sure, but just by sampling, we always noticed that, you know, after 4 or 5 days of lying in the dark, no bacteria was seen. But it was chlorinated anyway, just to make sure that the water maintained its purity when it was applied.
As you can imagine, there's day to day, there's not a lot of interaction that we do with the water that's up here, because as soon as it leaves the production plants, we are confident that it is safe and healthy for human consumption. So we don't really want to touch the water as is. What we do have here on site is our lab, and every day we test the water that's coming into our reservoirs from the 2 production plants we have, as well as we do random tests every week, taking samples from around Gibraltar, and to obviously make sure that the water continues to be safe for drinking. Like I mentioned, there is no real need to interact with the water, therefore kind of day to day it's mainly maintenance of the area. But we are constantly kind of monitoring our water, not just here in the lab, but also in our production plants where we have online testing and manual testing.
Well, the catchments used to sit on this area that you see there. In fact, part of the remnants you can see here, it was sitting on what was a natural sand slope. It's now been returned to nature, and in fact it's better than it used to be when they first constructed, because at that time there was just sand, but now it's been seeded and there's a lot of growth and vegetation and interesting wildlife as well. The water catchments, everybody thought that it was concrete when they looked at it from afar. But in fact, they were piles, timber piles sunk into the sand with rafters between them and then purlins between the rows. And then on top of that, there was corrugated galvanized steel sheets. But what happened was that in order to prevent corrosion and to make the water, shall we say, safer for drinking purposes, there was a lime and cement slurry painted over, and it was that that gave it the color to the catchment, and people passing by in ships thought that it was a concrete catchment, but it wasn't. Clearly an extension to the channel that you've just seen inside the channel went all the way through to the other end, and obviously that received the water. Again, there were a series of overflows along the way, because they never wanted to have overtopping of water to fall on the sands below and cause landslides. So it's properly drained in various areas all the way down to sea.
On the night of the 4th of March, high winds, reaching a speed of 57 knots, damaged about 1/10 of the water catchment area on the eastern side of the rock. Public Works Department employees and military personnel had to clear the area the next morning. A large number of corrugated iron sheets and wooden beams were blown across Sir Herbert Miles Road, and it was closed to traffic. No new sheets were laid in the area affected by the storm.
The water catchments only provided, when it was decided to stop using them, at that time it only provided 1% of Gibraltar's need, and it was the most expensive source, in fact, and the one which was more problematical to treat. We virtually walked through history from Victorian days up to the latter end of the 20th century. Clearly, things have advanced tremendously nowadays through desalination. That is where our main source of water is. And the reservoirs that you've seen, we are still enjoying the benefits of them because they are used. Clearly, the whole approach is now 21st century. The AquaGib have excellent laboratories here on site. All the modern telemetry, so that the pumping and everything else can be controlled remotely, and yeah, all that you would expect from a modern waterworks.
It clearly shows that forward thinking was evident there. We're talking about 100 years of history in one place, which hasn't required major works on it, so it's there to survive. The oldest reservoirs which are behind us is 1899, or 1900s I should say, and they haven't required any interaction with them. So quality of the build is there. It's evident for people to see.